in Romans chapter 9, the Calvinist says, well, the answer to the problem of Israel is that God never intended to save them. So what I want at this time is just to talk about 4 problems that the Calvinist has with that interpretation. If that really solves the problem of Israel that Paul is struggling with and writing about, why is it then that there are these 4 issues that I want you to think about? The first one is, why does Paul have great sorrow? See, Paul expresses this great sorrow at the beginning of Romans chapter 9. Well, why does he do so if the solution is God doesn't love them? God never intends to save them. And so doesn't Paul understand the implications of his own theology? Shouldn't he have sort of that stoical sort of response that often a Calvinist will have towards the lost? Because, well, it must be just that God hasn't chosen to save them. Which, even as a former Calvinist, we would feel this, feeling towards the lost. And we would see their hardness of heart, and we would see the mass of the world. And very many of us, I know, we would talk about it, and it would just be this idea that, oh, well, they're not the elect. And you cannot but be affected in that. But Paul is altogether different. Paul has this intense sorrow. In fact, that's what prompts him to write it to begin with. He's moved with love and compassion for his fellow kinsmen. So if the Calvinist is correct, and that really there is this mysterious purpose of God in which what answers the problem of Israel is that God really doesn't care about them, why is Paul so filled with sorrow? That's the first point that I think is a problem with the Calvinistic interpretation of Romans 9 to 11. The second one, how does salvation belong to the Jews if in fact God never intends to save them? Well, what do you mean salvation belongs to the Jews? Well, doesn't Paul say at the very beginning, to them belongs the adoption as sons. To them belongs the glory, the promises. From them would come the Christ. All these, So, well, how is it in any sense whatsoever that to them belongs this salvation? And the adoption as sons is an expression that only Paul uses. No one else uses that expression. And Paul only uses it in the context of those who are truly saved. Now, clearly the Jews who are outside of Christ and whom Paul is concerned about, well, they haven't yet obtained that adoption as sons. But to them belongs it. It's God's intention for them to have it. And so there's a real problem here if the Calvinistic interpretation to the solution to the problem of Israel is that God never intended to save them, when Paul has begun his whole concern with the fact that to them belongs the adoption as sons and all those things that are mentioned. Furthermore, if God never intended to save all of these kinsmen of Paul who are not believing, why does Paul hope, towards the end of the argument there in chapter 11, why does Paul hope to move them to jealousy so that he might save some of them? If he's talking about those who really God, doesn't, have any concern to say, because that's what he's talking about. He's talking about those who are not believing. That's the problem. And he's talking about them. And he says, well, with them, now I hope to move them to jealousy so that they might be saved. Well, that's a problem in itself as well. Lastly, the fourth problem with this interpretation is that why does Paul then end this section of Romans 9 to 11 now positively, optimistically? He's full of joy. He has hope. He even says that now they can obtain mercy. Well, at the beginning he was greatly sorrowful, right? He was moved with sorrow for these that to them belongs the adoption as sons. And if Calvinism is correct, that the answer is that God, well, he never intended to save them, and he actually doesn't love them, well, how then Paul has shifted from sorrow to like an ecstatic joy, an encouragement, that he can actually say, well, now my kinsmen according to the flesh are perfectly postured so as to receive mercy. 4 concerns about the Calvinist interpretation about the problem of Israel. Thank you.